Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second workshop in the RELI remote teaching series, Beyond Translingual Approaches to Providing Student Feedback. Now, some of you might have noticed that I changed the title to this talk, to this workshop. I had originally titled it Translingual Approaches to Providing Student Feedback. Now, I added the beyond to be more specific and to be clear about the multiple theories and approaches and areas of study and research that guide our curricular development in the Rutgers English Language Institute. So that translingual theory and translingualism spans disciplines. I had, emphasized translingual pedagogy for several reasons. First, I had found that upon arriving to Rutgers that in the writing program, this approach was not one that had been widely discussed or understood. So I wanted to be clear about what the tenets were, what the details of this and specifics of this approach were and entailed. And also, it's a great entry point for writing programs with a diverse faculty cohort with instructors from a variety of disciplines as we have. Translingual studies and translingual pedagogy spans the fields of linguistics, applied linguistics, and composition studies. And so it's a great entry point for scholars and instructors across disciplines. Now, that being said, because it is interdisciplinary, it is also necessary when you're talking about applying translingual theory to programming, to your curriculum, to understanding where that application originates, really. People who practice and enact translingual theory come from a variety of backgrounds. And so it will be enacted quite differently and applied quite differently. And so I made a word cloud here that really shows my orientations, my history, how I entered translingual studies. For me, I am a linguist, an applied linguist, a critical applied linguist who has worked in programming across writing programs and composition studies, but I've also created curriculum for language programs and in English and in Spanish as well. And you can see Hispanic linguistics are here. There are various subfields of linguistics that have influenced me. I've included the languages that have influenced me throughout my life in different ways, and then also other fields and types of texts like poetry, critical race theory, culturally responsive education, and pedagogy more broadly. And so you will see that in this the workshop today, when I'm talking about the different approaches, they are rooted in linguistic analysis, right? This is a linguistic approach to enacting translingual theory. And so I wanted to be clear about that. And I also didn't want to overemphasize translingualism as sort of the only, being very reductive about it. It is one of many orientations that influence my development, my course development and curricular development. And then underneath the cloud, I just wanted to bring back to reorient us to, throughout my work and in curricular development and in my career, these were the guiding objectives and the mission of my programmatic development. And of course in RELI. So contextualizing language studies, reconciling the cognitive with the social. So how do we apply, how do the discourses about language and who speaks language and why and how we learn language affect what we know about language acquisition and how we teach and learn languages. Definitely having a pluralistic and linguistic diversity orientation, right? So promoting linguistic diversity, and this is, of course, part of translingual theory, but also building from the variety of other approaches as well. So we want to really reorient ourselves to confront and challenge some of the monolingual ideologies that have limited our teaching, our learning, and also our knowledge, right? So if you're limiting language, you're limiting knowledge. So, understanding and confronting the ways in which we enact certain ideologies that aren't pedagogically sound, and really acknowledging that and transforming them, creating connections, creating more inclusive spaces, and toward a mission, a broader mission of linguistic and social justice. So, I wanted to really contextualize this workshop in, these orientations to really explain this as we move forward to apply this orientation to looking at student feedback, at giving student feedback specifically within this context. But these are overarching approaches and guiding orientations for all of our work here in RELI. But I wanted to recontextualize it for you. So with each workshop, I like to include some, guiding phrases, catchphrases, things to keep in mind, something to orient us with this theme, and something for you to reflect on as I give this talk. And so, feedback, when we think about feedback, I want you to, think of your reaction to this phrase here, to this thought here. Feedback is a conversation, not a response. So when we think of feedback, we often think of, right, the response to student work. And that response can have a range of interpretations and responses back. But it does not necessarily take that approach or have that consequence or outcome. So if you think of, for example, a final project response, feedback for a final project that students never see, right? So I would like to invite you to reorient yourself or reflect on feedback as a conversation, as something that's consistent, continuous, and responsive. And I'd like you to think of the activities that you create as a form of feedback. And I'm going to talk about how I enact this in the class, how this is structured within, from small activities to larger ones, and to, lead students to larger projects in their courses, and scaffolding their understanding of rhetorical strategies, course expectations and interpretations of audience, of reader for text type. So if you see this diagram here, this circle beginning with a planned focus activity, giving feedback, creating a new activity based on feedback. So activity as a form of feedback, giving more feedback, leading to more cumulative activities, speaking to the global and focus feedback. So we had discussed our global rubric, our global assessment, right, in an earlier workshop. And so when you're planning activities, so, I plan activities based on these consistent terminology, expectations within the rubric. All of the language, all of the categories, all of the terms, all of the expectations that are listed and detailed in the global assessment, in the rubric, I implement when I talk about activities, when I engage students, when I frame activities. And so the planned activities are engaging students in close, detailed work looking at 1 to 3 aspects of the global assessment, and always defining and modeling the terms. Responsive, then leading to responsive activities. After I assess that work, after the assessment, going back and creating activities in order to engage students directly in the feedback, with the feedback and the patterns that I had seen from that exercise. And this is a great opportunity to create grammar or structural choice activities in context, which we'll talk about. And then of course, I'm going to talk about the content of the feedback and commentary itself, and what that, what the expectations are, how to maintain consistency and keep this orientation. keeping the language use consistent, using terminology consistently, creating a space to mediate negotiation of meaning, right? In both written and spoken ways. One-on-one conferencing in this approach and inner orientation is not an option. It is necessary for this negotiation of meaning, for this conversation. And then finally, commenting from the role, from the place of an engaged reader, where you discuss and call students' attention to successful and unsuccessful choices that they make as writers, not policing, not error-focused in your commenting style. So I'm first going to talk about the focused activity guidelines. So this is where you really see the influence of linguistic analysis in the types of activities that I've created. And so in a focused activity, these smaller activities, I look to the overall assessment, the rubric, for example, the language that I use, aspects of what students are, of what expectations are, and then I create a very focused, detailed activity on choosing 1 to 2 areas of focus and detail, organization, support. And then within this, I always clearly define and model the terms that are used. It's not just saying it once, right? So reiterating it, providing the opportunity for students to then create agency to utilize the language about writing and their development as writers. And I'm explicit always in the relationship to effective writing and course goals. I create guided text analysis. And something that I'm going to talk about and reiterate in this talk is, finding that balance, the importance of finding that balance between guiding students, explicit instruction and modeling, and then inquiry and analysis and engagement, right? In order to, have students become aware of structures and sort of make their own rules, understand, create the tools to analyze and analyze successfully, right, rhetorical strategies as readers and understand the strategies and then implement them. You always want to guide successfully. You always want to be explicit and define as well. So this is an example I have here from it. This was a lesson from the students were reading the Dinan Mengetsu's Home at Last, and I think some of you have used this story, have read this this essay in your classes as well. And so this activity is focused on writing for detail, right? So you're always telling students, right? And it doesn't matter where the student's from, what their background is, and even for ourselves, right? Use specific language, incorporate more details. I'm always telling students that I'm always using the analogy of painting a picture, of visual imagery, to talk about detail. And I often reiterate that when I ask for more detail, or when I say, could you provide more detail here, it doesn't necessarily mean more words, but it's the quality of the language used. And so if you're giving feedback that simply says detail, give more detail, I'd like to hear more detail, could you explain? That's only, really conveying one sense to the student. It's not really negotiating or guiding in any way. How do you do that, right? How do you do that in another language? And so I create these very detailed lexical analysis activities. And so with this was an in-class activity that then students later built on for outside of class and continued in the next class. But and something that I often do is I read, when I'm talking about detail, I ask students to close their eyes and I read it aloud so that students can, and I say, what type of picture, visualize what I'm saying, visualize this person, this narrative. And so, I'll start reading, by that point, my father haunted by the death of his brother during the revolution and the ensuing loss of the country, right? After I read it, I ask them, could you see it? Could you see that person? And I ask them to describe. And so, I call attention and raise awareness of, the impact, right? The reader experience. And then I go to the more detailed lexical analysis, the linguistic analysis. So you'll see here I have some words and phrases marked in red. And so this is where then I call students' attention to this explicitly. And I talk about the choice of words, and I often compare it. At this point, usually students will have written some assignments, and I would say, you could choose, more detailed language. So I give them an example. So I call attention to the use of the word haunted by the death of his brother, right? Rather than saying, he felt bad about his brother's death, right? The impact haunted has versus feeling bad, right? And I call attention and give that example specifically. And then I also look at how lexical choices within the similar semantic fields lead to theme and tone. So in this passage, it's very sad. You get a feeling of loss, of emptiness. It's ghostly, right? So I call attention to the repetition of this type of terminology: haunted, death, loss, live and die, right? Whispering his name, this sort of walking back and forth, walking in grief, right? So we talk about how, the word choice then creates a tone and a feeling, and leads to, to impact the reader emotionally. So we do this very detailed analysis. Then I ask students to go back to the text and pick a paragraph or an excerpt that impacted them. And then at the following activity, they analyze it, they give their linguistic analysis, we discuss it. And then with the words that we have created, that we have listed, students will then engage and implement them. So, a very detailed linguistic analysis to scaffold those choices. Some other examples of focused activities include creating how-to guides, so doing more global sort of reverse outlining type of work, reader ratings and response. So sometimes I start with the rating, the response, and then move to explicitly connecting it to terminology about writing strategies, rhetorical strategies, and language from the assessments. These are great possibilities for cross-genre and cross-linguistic comparisons. So looking at the structure, structural features from one type of text, from a narrative text to an argumentative text, from a poem to an essay, right? From an academic text to, an informal text, right? Where students are then sort of creating rules, but then you present the guides as well. But you do this together, as well as organizational moves, right? And also, of course, lexical comparisons. And so this linguistic comparison is actually featured here. What I have in this example that you see is from a reading response activity for the EAP1 course, Writing Across Cultures. And the full activity is that students choose a text from Writers Across Borders, or Writing Without Borders, in an original language, a language other than English, and the English version. And so they respond to each language, each story, each narrative or essay individually, and then they do a comparison. So if you look at the questions that I have here, again, this is small focused work that builds and scaffolds. So I always, rather than saying, read this essay and then summarize it for me in 250 words, right? I like to start with, what 3 words would you use to summarize this text? They never go above 5 usually. And then if you see also here, I have, if you think of the words in another language, in a language other than English, write in that language first, and then write the English translations. And so you start to work within these nuances as well, and lexical and awareness and choice. what 3 words most strongly describe how you feel after reading the text? And this is also, again, an entry point, especially in the cross-linguistic comparison, right? How a reader is affected by word choice. And then they can also gauge how they're affected emotionally as a reader, in different languages, across languages. And then I also ask students to choose excerpts and then quote them and translate them. Again, more of that awareness. And then creating an advertisement or a story, what images would you include? Other ways to understand the reader response. And then subsequent activities then will bridge to the production of these strategies when students are creating their own narratives, when they're writing and choosing these strategies and implementing them as writers. Okay, so moving to responsive activity. The responsive activities are activities that I create or modify if I had an original plan, maybe anticipating this movement, that are based on the assessments and the feedback that I gave from the first activities, the guided and focused activities. So I note patterns. So I'm giving feedback, right, for each student, but then I also keep a log of the patterns of challenges and then also examples of exemplary work and choices that students made, within the class. And so then I create a new activity that we engage in together, and students engage in revision of, if it was a narrative assignment or something that they would be revising to submit again, then we do that work together. And I create an activity to guide students through that process and to discuss these patterns in context with the class. This is a great opportunity. It provides you the space to negotiate meaning together, actually, and scaffolding the process of revision, of understanding, of creating these choices, and of the awareness of the effects on the reader, and then reapplying these strategies. It also contextualizes structural choices to apply to revision. So, there are still places, I think, that do these decontextualized grammar exercises. I never do grammar exercises in any class. I can't really remember the last time I did them, at least a decade ago, probably, in some way. But I always, any structural choice activity is contextualized within the student's own writing, where they're applying these choices, where they're, made aware of these choices, and then making new choices based on that for the writing they're actually doing. So this is an example here I gave of revision tips for a narrative draft. So it's in one of my classes, the students were drafting, it was actually a comparison activity about student personal stories that they were reading. And so I returned the draft with their specific comments, of course, for each individual student, but then as a class, I spoke to the patterns of challenges and also what succeeded. The examples I gave here are from student work. I modify them a little bit. Of course, I don't put any names with them, but it's recognizable. And I, give very detailed comparisons and explanations of what more successful choices are. So I say, instead of, right, compare, they both want to improve situations, with the detail of, Autumn wants to tell the true history of her ancestors to Native children, and Charmaine wants to improve the unequal treatment for women in science. So, where I'm in the individual responses, the students have the papers with them, I say, this is, yes, you understand that they want to improve their situations here, but please provide more detail. I don't know the details of how the situations want to improve since you're comparing them. So then, since we're discussing this, they have that commentary in front of them, and then I ask them to make this comparison, and then students start to revise in class, rather than, you give the feedback, students may or may not read it or apply it later on. So that's what the follow-up activities are, really to negotiate. And then while students are, reading the commentary, we're looking at this together, when they start working on the revisions, then you can negotiate meaning with them. So I give them the space to workshop and to begin their revisions, and then have those discussions one-on-one with the students. Okay. So now we're going to move to the commenting itself, and constructive commenting, and what that entails. So again, you want to take the orientation of an engaged reader, rather than a policing stance or an error-focused stance, right? This is part of the conversation as well. When returning to that idea of conversation, right, you want to contextualize what the choice is. When you're pointing out unsuccessful or successful choices, you want to contextualize all of those comments. And first, in commenting, focus on patterns within the different categories. So structural choices, rhetorical choices, patterns where that have been challenging, of areas that are challenging. I think of sort of that old idea of like marking up a paper. I had certainly had, experience as a student, instructors who just marked every single little thing, and that's dizzying. You can't focus. It's like if you were engaged in a conversation with someone and someone interrupted you every other word, right? It wouldn't be motivational. You wouldn't be able to get anything across, and you didn't learn anything, and you don't even know, where to start, in order to develop any of these, this awareness or strategies for the next version. And so, really just focus on patterns, places where there are patterns that you see that impede meaning. Taking a functional grammar approach, and I'm going to discuss this a little bit more in detail later in this talk, but it's contextualizing your feedback about grammar structural choices, right? So focusing on not just saying verb tense is wrong, verb form is wrong, adjectives wrong here, syntax is awkward. Okay, how did the choice they made structurally affect the meaning for you as a reader? Really bringing that awareness about what the language does, what the structures do, right? And how they affect meaning. And there's some examples here in my comments, and I'll talk about functional grammar in detail in a little bit. Referring, again, consistency in language terminology that you're using in your assessments, in your rubrics. Always explaining yourself, right? Avoiding one-word responses, even if it's good, right? What's good about it, right? Good, unclear. Avoiding abbreviations, right? Things like AWK for awkward, or, any type, VT, WC, all of those, the abbreviations that were used, used to be used, but aren't really implemented even in the US much anymore, much less in other contexts. If you have abbreviations, explain them and introduce them. And that's what we did with the categories, and why that's written explicitly on our rubrics. If you notice here, I have some examples of comments that I have taken from some student work from last year. And I've used our abbreviations, the rhetorical choices, structural choices as well, so that students can then relate them to the rubric and go back to that. So, if you notice, my orientation is an engaged reader, right? Excellent detail here. This sounds like a powerful lesson. I'm reiterating, I understood what you meant to say, what the message you meant to convey here. This is great. This is, detail. It's a great rhetorical choice. Here's some structural choices. So add S for plural. And then this is a pattern the student had, and the student was saying 2, 3, and then not including the plural. And so I wanted to call their attention to that. I said, you're describing more than one moment. So this was in a moment. And, I wanted to just give a little bit of extra information there and call the student's attention to it. Another pattern. So this student was trying to incorporate making someone do something. And she had attempted this in multiple places, and it was clear that she was, she was in this position where she's acquiring this form. And so if it would have been a lone example, I probably wouldn't have mentioned it. But, if you notice here, I say this is the same structure as think in your paragraph above. Make students explore, not exploring. And she said something like make us thinking prior to that. And then there was another example later on. And so because it was a pattern, I called her attention to it. And then also, of course, tenses, right? Rather than just saying verb tense, or, change the past tense or correcting it for the student, I link to that, to the verb, and I say, when telling something in the past, use the past tense, arranged, had, and I give the examples from the text. And then I further explain it can be confusing for the reader to use present when you're talking about a memory. So she was using present tense and saying, this memory I had, and was, set it up in the past, but then kept going back to the present. And so, and I give examples from her text, arranged an interview, had the opportunity. So I contextualized it and explained the effect that it has on the reader, the choices that she made with verb tense. And then I also have an example of, a positive, where it's sort of mixed. This other example, what an amazing experience. I'm happy you found the group. She was talking about a dance group. Can you explain more about the group itself? What type of dancing is it? So I wanted to know more as a reader. I mean, it was a great, experience. I was excited. It was an engaging paragraph, but I wanted to know more. And so I engaged in that way rather than just saying detail, right? Provide details. So I want to, quickly here interject with, as we're in this new remote environment, commenting on Canvas. So on our learning management system, what's great about commenting on Canvas is that it's actually, this is a part that's really user-friendly in Canvas. You have the toolbar here. I just have, just pointing this out. Many of you have already been using this, but, uploading, adding your rubric, using SpeedGrader. When I'm in the face-to-face context, I use the grading systems, the commenting systems in the learning management system, both for the reasons that I don't like handwriting anymore. It's clearer for students. And it's just cleaner, it's easier. Some of you said you like to color code, with different aspects. You can do that. It gives them this global view, always legible, right? And you could use the toolbar to, mark, to make comments on the text itself, to underline, to strike through, to do different things very easily. And then if you look at part 7, what's labeled number 7, you can give some global comments. So, you've uploaded, you have your rubric there, the global assessment, and then you're speaking to that, right, in your comments. And then you are then typing in the comment box sort of a global, overview of patterns, and that speaks to, what you mark on your rubric then on the sort of the grade you assign or the number you assign. So it's all very cohesive and it's together and you're using the same language. And of course, remember with our activities that you're creating, you're then anticipating, you've been speaking this language the entire time and scaffolding and working in this, in this way of assessing and commenting in different ways, in very focused ways. Okay, finally, I want to talk about, give a little more detail about what I mean by implementing a functional grammar approach to talking about grammar in class. And I have a little, reference to, this is showing generationally and culturally here, the Schoolhouse Rock, Conjunction Junction, right? If you know the song Conjunction Junction, what's your function? So it's a functional grammar cartoon. For those of you who don't know, this was a series of public service announcements in the 80s, in the 1980s, that were just sort of educational, about different things about grammar. There are nutrition ones. There is also about government and things like that in these little cartoons. And so, the song said, what, conjunctions, what's your function? And then it would say hooking up words, and there was a train, and it showed really the function of what a conjunction does. So, so if you're, calling attention to conjunctions, in the use of conjunctions in writing, right, you want to say, oh, you're not linking this correctly, rather than no conjunction or new conjunction here, right? So, thinking of that, what this does, what that part of speech, what that structure does in a sentence and what it means for the overall global meaning of a text. So when you're talking about grammar, right, rather than just labeling, right, and just saying, wrong verb tense, wrong adjective, agreement's wrong, change this is incorrect. You want to talk about, you want to contextualize those choices. You're still going to use the language of grammar and define it. I always use the language of grammar, and I list that for students, and it depends on their background. Students learning English as another language usually have that terminology. Students who come through the US system often don't. So I make sure we review all of that, the language of language teaching and learning. But always contextualizing it, right? What does it mean, right, to make those choices? How does it affect meaning to switch back and forth from past and present? How does it affect meaning? So pronominalization, how does it affect meaning? Or what type of text is the expectation of, using the first person? When can you use, what texts use the third person, use the first? When do you mix? How, what choices are you making? If you're creating this syntax, right, what does that do for the reader? If you're making a choice syntactically that's not expected, that's outside of the pattern, how does that affect the reader's experience and understanding of your text overall? And if you do that enough, does it impede meaning throughout, right? So, a functional grammar approach answers, what does this structure do? How does it affect meaning locally and globally in a text? It allows, again, then, for negotiation of meaning, especially in one-on-one conferences. So, this is very important. This approach opens this space for when you're speaking with students and negotiating, either, written, but also in one-on-one conferencing. Did you mean to do? You can ask, because sometimes, you're not sure, a student might be making this choice deliberately, to call your attention to something, or they understand a word or a structure, in this way, or they saw it in this way before. You want to negotiate this meaning. And then again, the overall effect is that this further connects the reader to writing strategies. So, with functional grammar, I not only take that approach in, commenting and giving feedback to students, but in the linguistic analysis, right? So you see the circle, you see how it comes full circle, calling students' attention to what person are they using in this text, right? This is a personal narrative. What language are they using? What features, what structures are using, or is the writer, what choices is the author making to convey this meaning in this form? In this poem, how's it used? In this academic article, how's it used? In this essay, how's it used? In this advertisement, right? In this meme, in this text message, right? So creating that awareness of how structural choices authors have used as a reader, and then again, bridging to the application and creating awareness of how to make those choices as writers. Okay, so to finish up, I wanted to just, bring everything back together to bring everyone's attention to really, what this means then within our courses and then beyond our courses, right? So continuing the conversation, right? Both within class and outside of class and, within our program. Consistent, continuous, and varied feedback, right? Scaffolds the writing process, right? Helps students to develop a meta language on writing and also on expectations, creating this awareness, developing an awareness of expectations and a language for it, and engaging in this way. Creating, developing language to talk about their choices, which then develops awareness of challenges and strengths they have as a writer. That leads to, of course, the development of their identity as a writer, right? Agency, voice. You know, for first year students from all backgrounds and all places, right? They are forming new identities in their lives. They often, you know, I've taught first year writing across student populations, and many students do not have an identity as a writer, right? They don't feel like they're writers. They couldn't even articulate that in any way. They feel that there's no agency, right? And this has to do with also practices in schooling and orientations, right? Well, what do you want me to say, right? Is their response. And, you know, this orientation is, well, what do you want to say? You know, what do you want me to what's your message? What do you want me to understand? What would you like to convey? You know, and having that conversation about how to convey that successfully. And the choices, and also defending the choices that are made. At the end here, I have, you know, this is a reminder that this is applicable to the current course, right? And in the case of our undergraduate EAP courses, right, other courses as well. I want to reiterate that internally in our program, we have this idea that our courses are part of a sequence leading up to expository writing. When that is an internal structure that we've created, in practice, all of our students are matriculated students, and these expectations for writing, they're held to these expectations in all of their other classes equally with all other first-year students. So we need to keep that in mind. And this allows students, this approach and the way that we've structured the courses as well, and, you know, engage students in these conversations about expectations, are keeping this in mind. And then, you know, this is a response to students' need to know how to write. In the student evaluations, in my first year as director of RELI, I read all of the course evaluations of all of our programs for all of our students in RELI. I actually did. And you will know, if you're teaching EAP or EAD specifically, you might have seen this comments on your evaluation. So overall, the comments are very positive. The student, you know, that the students have given. However, if you notice, there's a slight sort of contradictory comment that reappears, and students say, I really wish I knew how to write an essay. I still want to know how to write an essay. And so I think, you know, this last point here, you know, redesigning our courses and taking this orientation to negotiate, to find that balance of explicit instruction and guided inquiry, to really peel back, to create that analysis, to, you know, look at the mechanics of what do these choices mean, right? On these micro to then macro levels. This is, you know, the addition, this part is being strengthened, you know, with our redesign and with our approach. So that might have been an area that needed some development, given those comments that I noted, you know, from students, as I'm tasked to, you know, develop and unify these programs and, you know, and apply best practices. And, you know, for this context, you know, given the students' feedback in that way, that was indicative of the need to really, you know, strengthen that connection and find that balance more cohesively, and tying that explicit instruction and feedback to the guided inquiry, and engaging students, you know, in these small ways, and noticing, you know, what are the strategies that you're noticing as a reader, and then applying that as a writer. I wanted to end on that note, in contextualizing it within our programmatic developments within RELI. So thank you for attending this lecture, attending this workshop. We will now discuss some of the questions that you might have, or even open it up to, you know, to share some of your experience.